player Will.
Welcome back, Visions fans. Ready Player Will here. It is the Gilgamesh review from Final Fantasy V. The brand new unit dropped this week as part of the Final Fantasy V collaboration that's now returning to War of the Visions. And today's character review, pretty standard items. We'll look at the character overview, the commander effect, we'll go through the stats leading up to the report card, talk through some general thoughts, things I want to hit on, should you pull, and then we'll get into some specifics about the job and the TMR and the vision cards, all of that good stuff to come. And so, kicking things off here, brand new fire unit added to the game with the unique main job of Kooky Captain. He does have Strider and High Dragoon as the other sub-jobs. He does equip Spears as part of that Spear job classification for vision card grouping as well. He does equip the heavier Armor, Helm, and Accessories, with a move of 3, jump of 2 as a 100 cost unit, and my faith stat recommendation is definitely 50. Leave him at 50, you're totally fine, but I do think you could go as low as 30 in some instances. We'll talk about that more in the general thoughts in just a second, but for now, 50 is comfortable. Now, max range on his job is 5 squares away. He's got 3 AoE targeting abilities and 1 single target ability. From a weapon type resistance perspective, only negative 15% to strike. He does have a passive that can get that closer to 0, though, with the rest of these all sitting comfortably in that 10% range, upwards of 20% on the slash resistance. And in terms of status ailments, 50% to Frostbite, 50% to Berserk, the 10% to Confusion. Honestly, these are rather commonplace. At least the Frostbite and the Berserk ones are. Not the best I would have picked, but also not the worst either. At least they're around. That's got some benefits. The Mastery ability here, they gave him 15 AoE resistance, which is kind of a key part of his overall survivability that we'll talk about soon. 20 crit evasion as well. He's got 40 reaction block rate baked in innately from the Dream ability, 10 fire attack, and 10 crit damage just for some of that extra oomph on his attacks overall. Now, for the commander effect, he is dual, game mode only, and for fire units, he actually gives no benefits. He's the first commander so far that does not give a benefit to the element that he belongs to, but his job-based stats, he's got some extras there, more than the average commander does, and it is for Greatsword, Spear, and Staff Black Mage. It's initial AP of 10, accuracy of 15%, acquired AP of 20%, Spirit of 10, chain resistance 20%, and crit evade 10%. A really nice selection of items there. Unfortunately, though, I'm not a big fan of this commander effect altogether. The in-game ability is 25 pierce attack, 25% HP, and 30% crit evade for 5 turns. Now, at the end of the day, these are all just free stats when you throw him in the commander slot, but that being said, he is one of the best spear units, and so it's hard for me to envision a scenario in the dual game mode where you use some spear units, but not him. And so to that effect, you're really just talking about like Greatsword and Staff Black Mage, which is nice on the one hand. Those certainly are strong classes, but when you look at the ability itself, Pierce Attack 25 obviously only helps the spear units. So while this is obviously nice to have as an item, I'm not actually a big fan of the commander effect overall, and it's not really a big consideration for where his potential value lies in your account. Now, when we get into the stats overall, base stats, he's absolutely there with all of these post-Joom units. His HP is in that bracket where all these new units are. He is in this higher echelon of base attack. The base dexterity, not amazing, but it's in a pretty common area. They do make up for that in the board stats that we'll see in a second. And his base luck does also fall into that higher category overall. Really nothing here to complain about. When we look at the total stats, when we add in things like the board nodes, the master ability, things of that nature, he does get a fair amount of extra bulk, so much so that he's at the top tier of innate HP overall. Takes a small step back on the attack, but that's really only one part of the equation when it comes to damage. The dexterity, though, they gave him 126 points here on the board. It might lead you to believe that he's an insanely good crit rate unit because of it, and he's above average, but this really is just kind of making up for the base dexterity, I think, where they did kind of gimp him a little bit compared to some of these newer units, and the luck overall ends up in a pretty good spot. Regardless, the total stats, I'm very happy with this. When we get to the agility percent here, this is with the main slot and sub slot vision cards. He's also a very fast unit, in my opinion. Innately speaking, he's at about that 84 agility, gets upwards of near 91, and so he's right there with where the fastest units are overall in the game. I think this is a really good thing. Admittedly, though, you will not always have this agility passive on, though, so I think you can expect him to be in that tier of 84 agility, which is still above average, but certainly not near the top. Now, for the other stats, the innate critical hit rate, although he's got all of those dexterity points on the board, he's got no crit hit rate percent up on the board, and really nothing else in terms of passives, or obviously we saw mastery abilities or 140s to amplify the crit hit rate. And so while it's good, it's not amazing. The crit avoidance rate, though, he does obviously skew much higher than normal because of what they gave him on the MA2. In terms of total accuracy, innately speaking, he's not bad, he's not awful, but he does have a passive that you can equip that gets him to a very competitive spot from overall total accuracy, and his evasion with luck scaling equips does put him kind of in that pseudo-evade tier, potentially. But at this day and age, the accuracy power creep and the fact that people are gearing to hit top-tier evade units like Riku and Venera, he's likely not going to be dodging a whole lot unless you're really going all out, which is possible, but not all the time. Now, for the report card overall, effective HP is a B for me. It's actually a little bit lower than many of the units we've seen as of late. No defense, no spirit, 15 AoE res, but no unit res, no AoE wide res, no honeycomb barrier, no percent reduction like magic percent reduction of 5%, nothing like that. The innate weapon resistances are pretty decent as we saw, but really nothing crazy here for his effective HP, and his survivability to me is a B+. He does have a general barrier, courage, and he is capable of sealing courage removal on his enemies. He's got a heal back. He can reduce enemy magic damage of what they do for total damage to your team by 20%. He's got a fair amount of debuff weakening mechanics, and he can reduce the enemy AoE resistance penetration, which goes really well hand in hand with his innate AoE resistance that he can kind of protect against them penetrating that stat a little bit. Now, damage-wise, I think it's a B+. You can get anywhere from 40 to 80 defense pen very comfortably. He's got two passives that can do that. He can remove Protect 2.0, as we call it in the 5th anniversary here. He's got a physical barrier break, but it is only on his limit break, and a 15% piercing peril on hit after his second buff. And he does have, overall decent crit rates, and he does have a follow-up attack capability too that is very potent from a damage perspective. But to me, I've yet to really see him nuke some enemies like we saw with Gilgamesh, the ice version, or with units like Shreka, or some of these units that really benefit from the chaining, like the gun units or the evade units. Now, agility is an A-, we talked through that, and I'm going to speed through some of the rest of this here. Accuracy, I think, is an A-. It's fair, innately, 25% on a passive, and he's got an ability that will have an extra 30% chance to hit on that single ability use. No guaranteed hit in the kit, though. The evasion, for me, is a B. He's a pseudo-evade unit. The movement is also a B+, because he is a jump 2 unit. He does have move +1 on a sub-job buff as well, so overall, I like that he has that jump flexibility. The auto ease of use for me is an A-. Really nothing too complex about the unit, but the game disruption for me is a B. He is a great unit, but he's only fair versus the current meta teams, but I think he can be built to compete with most of them. Maybe not all of them simultaneously at once, but he's got enough strengths in his kit for each one of the metas that we're seeing that you certainly can build him to compete with them in various ways. I do think, though, that this unit is going to get better as time goes on, because some of the meta that we're seeing still is, quite frankly, just kind of lingering a little too long that we'd like to see, and I think is about to phase out a little bit once we get X-Death and the new Mont unit and Rosaluna and all of them, where once we see this future start to unfold, I think Gilgamesh is going to perform a little more consistently. Now, the passives encounter and overall jobbing kit, really nothing awful. It's not the greatest thing I've ever seen. The counter ability I'm a little underwhelmed by, and the overall jobbing kit, great utility on paper, but I think it does require some overall external support in terms of a healer to support him or a teammate to give a couple other sort of buffs that he's lacking innately for a final grade of a B+. I mean, he's a very good unit that can be built to deal with a variety of things, but not without some flaws. And so my general thoughts on that point, when I say he can be built to fight a variety of teams, that doesn't necessarily mean that it can beat them all at once. It's more just so that he's got the tools that if you build a team a certain way to be like anti-magic or anti-evade or a little bit more of a bulkier team, he's got things that lend itself for each one of those different kinds of builds, which is kind of nice. Makes it for easier flexibility when team building. And he does have some good overall variety in his attack types, so he's got 4 different AoE AoE patterns in that Kooky Captain main job and sub job, follow-up attack, a 60% slash crush, a 60% defense crush on the sub job, and he does have some in-air Dragoon type attacks versus the instant attacks, so he can attack you a couple different ways, and obviously his jump 2 helps him do that. He is also very much debuff weakening centric, where he can give himself a bunch and reduce enemy debuff weakening on hit, and while this is an exceptionally powerful stat in the new power creep of the game, I don't think I've seen units that really tap into like reducing enemy debuff weakening really like pop off. Cypher comes to mind, and while he's very good and high quality, I don't think it's the game changer that we might have made it out to be initially, but it is obviously still very impactful. Just a little bit hard to quantify at times. He does have great AP management. He's got 20 on a teammate buff, and you'll get 17 of it from the TP conversion. His weapon is also a decreased 15% AP consumption for himself as well. And although he does have some good survivability tools, I do think he's overall a little squishy, and it's most noticeable versus those evade units and Shrek and overall single target ability units, where he really doesn't have any unit res innately, nothing on a buff, and enough of them have some barrier break within those teams that his general barrier can be broken by a variety of ways, like the Shrek limit break, or Venera's got the barrier break. The King Mont unit has a pretty decent barrier break that Gilgamesh can't seal it, so if you're not pairing him with Resnick, who gives him that barrier seal, that barrier and his overall survivability is kind of boom or bust. And that being said, I do think he will thrive a little bit better against those AoE scaling abilities, because he can reduce the level of enemy AoE penetration. And so you are going to want to focus on those kind of enemies. And just on that note of the 30 Faith, I like it just for the anti-magic angle in terms of reducing the damage he takes. But if you're pairing him with a support, you might want to go to that 50 or higher to make sure he can get the full value of those heals. And his limit break does have some effects that are subjective to what your faith level is, and it's got protect, shell, and haste on the limit break. So if you're below that 50 faith, you might not get some of those off. So it's one thing to entertain. I know we talked about it a lot more as of late because of how prevalent Sodali and Exia, Shrek, a lot of good magic damage dealers. He's one of these units that I don't think it's the end of the world if you go lower, but I think 50 is totally just fine as well. Now for the should you pull, to me the answer is no. He is a great unit, but Pierce has never really been a reliable job for casual players. The selection of Pierce units overall, they get spread out so far between the timeline of power creep that it's really hard to make some cohesive teams around them. And to me, X-Death and Mont, and even I said Rosaluna, but I meant Mavia, Glaciella's mother, the ice bow unit coming out, in addition to some of the other future units, I'm sure you'll likely get some more bang for your buck in terms of power level, and quite frankly synergizing with quality existing teams and units. Right now, Gilgamesh's partners are a little more limited, I think, to the average player. I think he's best for accounts that already have a lot of things already. He's not a unit that you really build around, more so that he's a unit that you can put into something and really try to make a synergy with the team itself. And to me, it's more of a niche commander ability and kind of a niche vision card too. It's not a bad vision card, but it's obviously very Pierce heavy. I don't think you'll get a lot of usage out of it outside of the Pierce team. So as far as Gilgamesh is concerned, I just don't think you get as much value for this unit as you would for others. Now, if you're just spending and you really, really love this unit, obviously he's a great unit. You're going to have a lot of fun with him. But just for a casual recommendation, probably a no for me. And that's coming from someone who insta-maxed him on day one. He's literally sitting at 65 reincarnations right now as we speak. I've done a fair amount of testing with him alongside JB. And although he's good, I can tell you he's fine. He's not blowing me away by any means compared to what some of these other units are doing. Now, for the passive abilities here, the Guardian of the Big Bridge, you will always have this passive on. I think you're going to flex between these two others, though. One of them is the extra defense pen and accuracy, which I have this on personally. The other option, though, is for the agility percent, but we're really not seeing a lot of strike damage in the game at the moment, so this is kind of a wasted passive in the sense that it's really just more for 7 agility points. That is good sometimes, but not always. I think Natural Instincts get you a little bit further right now, but certainly these other two passives aren't the worst in the world either. I just don't think you'll often have them on for auto PvP. And for the counter abilities, he's got the preemptive counter. It's the 70% chance to proc. It's got some decent range on it, but it's only against slash and pierce damage, which to me is rather niche. There's just not enough pierce units in the game to make this a really valuable counter. The slash damage, sure, but even then, there's enough reaction block rate currently that I don't really see this being an enormous game changer like some of these preemptive abilities were a little while ago. Now, for the main job buffs, his teammate buff is the 50% general barrier for 4 hits. He increases his debuff weakening for himself and allies, and for himself and allies, he will decrease enemy debuff weakening on hit. He can also restore AP on that, 20 AP immediately when he casts this. He also has an HP heal back, and when he falls below 50% health, he'll also generate Shell 2.0, which is basically a reduction of magic damage of 20%. It's fine, but 20% is not game-changing either. The second one here is a really good self-buff. It's the Courage ability, which he can seal from that teammate buff that we saw up here first. It's also the activation of the follow-up attack here, which is really good. On that follow-up attack, it will decrease enemy unit resistance by 50% for just that cast. It also will grant on hit a 15% pierce imperil on hit, and it's also some missile resistance and AoE resistance for self as well. Now, for the main job, all of his damage scales off 120% of his attack stat. Little bit unique for spear users. I went back to some of the more recent spear users, and it's really only Fang who does that. The rest of them do scale off things like dexterity and luck, so you really want to focus on his attack stat here if possible. His abilities overall, I like the versatility that he does have a couple different shapes of AoE abilities, a couple different attack types. He's got the one slash type here with a really great slash crush of the 60%. This is also the extra 30% hit chance ability. It's virtually a guaranteed crit hit as well. It will also reduce enemy healing power and have a chance to poison as well. It's actually kind of nice that a 50% chance to inflict poison, so you can't just Truststone that away. He's also got this double hit diamond ability that can dispel courage, and this is also where you reduce the enemy magic damage by 20% for 3 turns, while also reducing the enemy's AoE respan. It's improperly translated here, but this will reduce the amount of damage they do on their AoE abilities. And finally, high jump. I am going to talk about this one more in just a couple minutes because there's some cast time associated with this. This is the removal of Protect 2.0 on these enemies, where it's the reduction of physical damage that it removes. Overall, I like the versatility of this main job, and I like it in conjunction with the sub jobs. And just real quickly on the cast time here, I have 3 different boxes here to simulate 3 different scenarios of what you might do for cast time down. The top one here is no cast time down at all. And there's really only 2 different kinds of cast time in his kit. One of them is high jump that we just saw in the previous slide, but on his sub jobs, he does have a regular jump and then an ability called Dragonlance Dive, and then technically has a drain jump as well. And again, a lot of words. You don't have to remember all the names of them. Bottom line is he's got 2 different cast times here. Most of them, 3 out of the 4 abilities are on a 280 cast time, which means if you don't do anything, it's going to take 4 ticks for him to actually come down. For the drain jump, it'll be 3 ticks. To me, that's a little bit slow in this day and age. If you go for a Truststone passive of reducing it by 200, you can bring 3 of those abilities down by an entire tick. So I do like that personally. There is the option of adding an Esper like Orochi, who is a fire-based Esper technically, that can reduce the cast time by 250. And if you do both that and the Truststone, you can reduce all of those abilities down to 2 ticks. I think this is overkill personally, but I was just stress testing it. I think the Truststone passive is likely the way to go. Now for the limit break, it is a 5 square away ranged ability with a range height of 3. Very, very versatile for what it does for the height there of the elevation differences. It's the physical barrier break. It's a 30% unit imperil on that unit for 3 turns, and it grants himself haste, protect, and shell all within the mid fight. I love this ability because it's not something that'll often get dispelled early in the fight. He's likely going to use this, 2 to 3 different turns in, so this could be a great fight changer halfway through the battle. Now for the sub jobs here, Kooky Captain, I actually don't mind this one. It does have a chance to paralyze here. I don't love that status element personally, but I like the fact that it's another slash type attack in the kit for that smaller AoE. I don't think this is going to do a lot of damage, so it's really not my favorite thing in the world, but I do like this other jump ability here that is the 60% defense shred. It's a range height of 5, so it does add in for some extra attack versatility too, and really for me, it's just a process of elimination of where the best sub job is. This is my second favorite sub job. He does have access to the Strider, but I don't love this sub job personally. I don't think he's going to do enough damage on it. It might be okay for PvE content because he does have some slow capability on it, but the Twisting Shield Break Breaker, that Dispel of Courage, he technically already has that on his main job, so it's kind of duplicative. This is not a cheap ability either. It's at 32 AP. I don't even know if his AI would prioritize it, quite frankly, because he's got no slash res pen. So these slash type attacks are really dependent on him using the Crush ability first, which if he does, okay, cool. But if he doesn't, then this conversation is kind of irrelevant. But the High Dragoon, I actually really like this sub job. Dragonlance Dive has the same cast time as all the others. This has the 30% Pierce and Peril on hit. The Drain Jump is a faster cast time, but I do like this one just for the sake of A, it's only 13 AP, so it's the cheapest ability in the kit, but B, I do like it for general survivability where he can regen some of that health. He will be in the air for a certain period of time, so he might be able to dodge some of the damage on the field if there's an enemy turn in between there, and I overall just think it adds another dimension to this unit. I'm probably going High Dragoon personally, and just having these two attacks on. I would play with the buffs, but I'm honestly not sure of the buff priority yet, and obviously it's going to depend on the map length, whether you can even get a third buff off or not. Now for the Team R review, it's an armor type. The stats on it, good for an armor, nothing crazy. You get the Human Killer of 25, and this is unique in that it gives, for the first time ever on a TMR, access to Protect 2.0, or the reduction of physical damage of 25%. I would have liked this a lot more in the past, but there's so many units nowadays that are removing Protect 2.0. I don't know if I like this TMR enough just for a self-buff. It's not the worst in the world, but also I don't think it's worth potentially giving up some of these newer buffs on units, which obviously are typically a lot more impactful. So TMR, it's not a bad TMR, but I wouldn't pull this unit for it, and I don't see myself using this TMR a lot, quite frankly. Now for the job-based vision cards, Spear has always had a pretty decent selection of overlap, and admittedly, it's actually gone through some fluctuations over time. Down below here, the colored arrows are my favorite synergies with other jobs, and the uncolored ones are ones that are kind of there, but could use a little bit of work. The game has gone through a bunch of lengths as of late to really amp up the synergy with both the Dagger and Katana class, which is a lot of strong units in there too, so that does bode well for the Spear group. It's also got some great historical synergy with Staff Devout, where a lot of supports reside as well, so love that grouping. Mace and Bow are a little more niche, obviously, when it comes to what characters are available in those classes, but there is a lot of great vision card overlap there too. And even just beyond that, you still have Axe, Book, Fist, and Gloves that I think all have some synergy. The Fists, unfortunately, have fallen behind at this point in the game and is really hinging on the Full Metal Alchemist card, which is not the best card in the world anymore. So this does still kind of exist, but man, I really don't believe as strongly in the Strike and Pierce synergy that I once did. But Book has gotten a couple as of late, and Axe is kind of the same thing, that there's really just not enough characters for me to heavily consider it, but obviously there's some gaps in some of the other classes, like Staff Black Mage. It's got no cards in common with Greatsword. Sword Warrior and Sword Knight are kind of lacking as well. So there's still some work to go for some of these other popular classes, but overall, I think the Dagger, the Katana, and Staff Devout are in such a good spot that I think overall the Spear units can be splashed in to some of these Rainbow teams. Now for the unique equipment, he does have a unique weapon. It's the Genji Glaive here. It's the 20 AoE pen extra for himself. AP consumption down to 15%, and an extra crit damage and pierce attack. I personally like this weapon. I have the aim build, or the accuracy build, currently. We are getting a Trials of Reckoning in the future that will have a Final Fantasy V unique piece of equipment too. I actually do like this one a lot. It's the 10 unit res. It's got some innate resistances here too. This is more for Venera, the new unit that came out that has a lot more paralyze and stun in her kit. So the elements are a little more niche, but I do like the ability overall that it's a 20% physical damage reduction for him, while giving the free 20 accuracy in the box stat too. I'm not going to say this is a best in slot item for him, but it does help his survivability versus the physical type teams, which right now he's got the general barrier and not a lot else. So this helps. And just for the general optimization, I personally do like the Genji Glaive, but the Dragon Whisker is still, I think, the best spear for him overall. It's got some great stats on it. You have the all element apparel on it too. I threw in the TMR option of the Light Halberd here. This is Veln's TMR. That's got some accuracy upon critical hit. It's 30% accuracy. I don't love this weapon, but in an evade meta, when you're really starving for sources of accuracy, it's worth an honorable mention that it exists. But I think the Dragon Whisker is probably my personal favorite, but Genji Glaive is a close second as well. And just in terms of other equips, this is really just dependent upon what you're facing. I think the Maximilian armor is the safest armor to go with, but I think the Alex or Ring is a very popular second choice here. The rest of them are good options. It's really just a matter of what you have available and what you think might help you beat the enemies that you want to. And when it comes to Espers, I also think it's kind of straightforward. There really isn't any de facto like best Pierce Esper, and so I think going with ones like Odin and Dark Bahamut are still the best overall DPS Espers. I mentioned Orochi here for the cast time down, but it's got some other stuff in it, like the fire attack, the healing power. It's got magic resistance, and it's got a fair amount of agility on it that it's a pretty speedy Esper overall. And Dark Titan actually has some human killer on it, which also does help his follow-up attacks, some crit damage. This is not the worst Esper either. The other ones listed down below are just some generic fire Espers where I don't think these are best in slot Espers, but going through the fire options where you have the fire attack modifier on them, there's some nodes on there that I think you can add if you want to make them bulkier, if you want to get the accuracy a different sort of way. I don't love them, but it would be wrong of me to not list them. And then for TMRs, I really mean this, same as always, I think agility TMRs are best and ones with on-hit effects. There's really not a TMR that I think really amplifies him or adds a lot of dimensionality to him. I would probably just stick to his two main buffs and see if you can wrinkle in a third from one of the sub-jobs. Worst case scenario, maybe go for a TMR that's got some survivability, like the Gilgamesh TMR, the Ice Gilgamesh one that's got the honeycomb barriers. But even then, that's a TMR that's got no agility on it, so it's really going to come down to what your turn order is. Now, for my favorite teams, I do think the Mono Fire team is overall still one of the best, and it's really just the fact that Sephiroth and Summer Resnick are so damn good that you can still run this team against the field. Obviously, Exia is still like a hard counter to them, but they beat the majority of a lot of other things. I do think there are other options, so I like him with the Evade girls. Their vision card synergy with the Venera vision card is excellent for Gilgamesh, and he's just a great third option to throw in there. I have tinkered with the Ramada team and Lucille, which obviously this is a Pierce-oriented team. Admittedly, it's losing versus a lot of the meta teams, though. This is not great versus the Evade girls. It's okay, not amazing versus the missile teams, which even right now, we're not in a strong missile meta because of the current Guild War map. But even versus Shrek and Sadly, this team still struggles. So this Pierce team looks like it'd be amazing, but we haven't found a consistent way to win with it yet. And outside of these three teams, there are still some other units that you could probably theory craft around. Obviously from the fire element, Crimson Wizard and Volk and Veritas of the Flame come to mind. You do have other Pierce options like Veritas of the Heavens and Glaciella, who Veritas of the Heavens I actually like a lot. We've had some very positive tests with him so far alongside Gilgamesh, but even units like Soul and Exia, theoretically that Staff Devout class could have some upside as well. But for now, this is generally where I'm keeping my Gilgamesh thoughts. Now for the Truststones, I think left side, HP or Luck are by far the two most available ones. I think the Luck is probably my favorite at this current time. The right side, I'm going Agility personally. You could throw an aim set on there theoretically too. There's no reason why you couldn't. In terms of the 6 passives though, I'm likely going with these 6, the attack, the defense pen. I do want the cast time down here for his jumping abilities. The fire attack of 10, the heal power of 10. The reaction block of 20 I think is debatable. He's got the 40% innately, and it's going to come down to your vision card support. There are a couple Pierce vision cards that have a reaction block rate on them too. The thing about reaction block, it's been very important for slash type units because there's so many counter abilities at that 70% chance to proc. But against Pierce damage, you don't get those same kind of passives, so you don't need the same amount of like overkill when it comes to reaction block for Pierce-oriented units. So I would sub out that reaction block 20 for really any one of these 4 on the right. There's not enough Pierce resistance in the game at the moment either that I'm using the Pierce res penetration of 10% yet. That obviously would be very important the moment people start gearing for the Pierce resistance, but it hasn't gotten there yet. And he's got the innate 15% imperil anyway on that second buff. So even for units that might have an innate, like, I don't know, 5%, 10%, 15% strength to it, he's likely bringing them down to 0 anyway. Honorable mention, I just don't think it's the time for it. So crit rate 10, I think, is a pretty safe one too. But that's the Gilgamesh review altogether. Again, this is a quality unit. If this is a unit that you really like, I'm sure you're still going to get some decent results with him. I can't say he's an absolute game changer, but I will say I think his best days are ahead of him. I think he's going to get stronger as time goes on, as we get some new tools to play with within the game, at least from a character and vision card perspective. But that's all I got for now. Please, as usual, comments, critiques, criticisms, throw them all in the comment section below. Would love to hear your thoughts on where you think I am either right, wrong, if you have a question or need a clarification. But that's it for now. Thanks for watching, everybody. I'll talk to y'all soon.